In 1666, an occultist organization began experimenting with a tonic that would transform the drinkers into horrific monsters. Their plans were thwarted, but almost 200 years later, a successor would come into possession of the methods to create this tonic, and would set off an apocalyptic event across London. The player must enlist the aid of either Ignatius Blackward or Nadia Franciscus to battle Adam Crowley's army of monsters and prevent a far greater catastrophe. Released in 1997, Nightmare Creatures is a third-person action game with a heavy emphasis on combat and quick decisions. Early 3D was a vast playground for developers who experimented with almost every aspect of their games to try and discern the best practices going forward. Kalisto Entertainment released their first two 3D games within a month of each other, and their experimental features are quite visible. Both games haven't aged as well as other games from this period, but that's to be expected when it comes to early 3D games. Many of the aspects of a video game can become obsolete within a very short period, one of the most obvious being what is considered groundbreaking visuals. Modern poly counts are astronomical, and current consoles and PC hardware are quite happy to load 4K textures. Displays have also changed considerably, with screen resolutions far surpassing the practical size of cathode ray tube televisions, and input methods have standardized in a consumer-friendly way. In order to capture gameplay footage from a PlayStation 2, I have to upscale the video output and convert it to HDMI because my capture card only has HDMI input. Audio recording quality has also improved significantly, but there aren't as many observable changes without a better understanding of how the entire practice works. Video games revolve around the player inputting actions to progress through the game. Developers at the beginning of 3D gaming had to figure out how to map controller buttons to influence a character's movement in a 3D environment. How should inputs on a 2D plane be employed within a 3D space? Control methods have homogenized throughout the years as users have become more comfortable with certain control styles. But in the 90s, developers had to experiment to solve this puzzle. Nightmare Creatures has aged in all of these aspects, but it is also surprisingly modern in other places, and because of this is one of the most unique games from the early 3D period. The game's horror theme and brutal difficulty invoke comparisons to Bloodborne, although much less refined. And while both games have similarly capable enemies that contribute to each game's challenge, a lot of the difficulty within Nightmare Creatures sits within the controls. Tank controls aren't the problem here, although there are instances where the game does require movements that aren't easy to perform with tank controls. Instead, the issue lies with a hefty input buffer. Further, the game also uses a lives mechanic that only serves to waste the player's time whenever they run out. And, of course, it might not be the standout visual experience it was, but there is something about PlayStation graphics that appeals to me. Nightmare Creatures is a horror action game set in 1800s London. The environments are appropriately city-themed, although there are a number of gardens, interiors, and tunnels to break up the number of street levels. While the streets are relatively varied due to the game travelling through a number of London's boroughs, without the trips to the Docklands or the zoo, the environments would quite easily melt together. Many of the streets feature breakable shopfronts, ornate iron fences, and various brick textures across most surfaces. The characters are brilliantly varied, however. The human characters are quite standard 90s 3D humans, but the two playable characters boast a deep collection of animations that are very impressive. Enemies range from zombified humans to animated stone gargoyles, freakishly mutated abominations to demonic hounds, and that's before factoring in the various bosses. Pieces of some enemies can be torn off, and their attacks can be neutered as a result. Also, every enemy can be cut into pieces, which is pretty unnecessary but also awesome. The soundtrack features a range of styles too. While the majority of the game uses understated electronic music as a backing to explore to, Nightmare Creatures will occasionally bust out a metal track during the more difficult enemy encounters. Most levels have a limited smattering of the various enemy types instead of having a wide variety within every level. Sometimes the level will only contain 2 enemy types, despite many more having been introduced previously. I don't really understand why these limitations exist, since there are levels that do have a broader selection. The basic zombie enemy is expertly used throughout Nightmare Creatures. While their attacking capability isn't incredible, they often appear alongside another enemy that demands more of the player's attention. This allows the zombie to sneak up and deal damage if the player isn't prepared. They are also one of the few enemies that can be killed in a single hit, which allows the player a means to demonstrate their improvement as the game goes on. Later on, there are more dangerous zombie enemies with more complex attacks that can also be killed in a single hit. Some enemies, like the werewolves, are quite hesitant to attack and will scurry around the player's threat range in hopes of finding an opening. There are also hulking enemies that charge the player, but aren't particularly good at defending themselves. And other enemies, like the mosquito, are similarly aggressive, but much better at keeping themselves alive. Each enemy offers a unique challenge despite having similar plans of engagement, and the fire-breathing dogs will deal a ridiculous quantity of damage to the player every time. Dodging their attacks wouldn't be so bad if the buffer wasn't such a prevalent issue. I must reiterate that controls weren't fully figured out during the early 3D period, and that tank controls aren't inherently bad, but don't mesh ideally with 3D action gameplay. I think it is odd to have the player move horizontally to an enemy with tank controls. Nightmare Creatures does have a dodge to the side on R1 and L1 buttons, but this movement orbits the enemy, which means that the character will move on more than one axis. The player has a lot of flexibility within Nightmare Creatures in order to make control easier. Holding circle allows much more precise control in order to avoid some hazards. Unfortunately, this precision is not available when jumping over hazards, and the rare platforming sections are frustrating as a result. In combat, the player has access to a vast combo tree to defeat enemies with. Stringing together moves in certain sequences causes high damage hits to come out and devastate the enemy's health. There are a number of these combos to find, and the game expects the player to find them without hints. These attacks have a significant buffer which can sometimes make the combat floaty, and cause the player to move into danger. As the city begins to burn during the latter half of the game, the likelihood of battling an enemy into flames and being killed by the flames is almost a guarantee. Nightmare Creatures boasts an impressive 16 levels and 4 boss arenas that push the game's total runtime to about 8 hours. Each level takes place in a different location within London, like Pimlico or Chelsea, and while it may seem as though each level is around 25 to 30 minutes in length, the truth is they're much shorter than that. The highest total time it took for me to finish a level from the start was around 17 minutes. Each level features a mixture of combat and exploration, which is forced forward by the adrenaline mechanic. Whenever the player defeats an enemy, their adrenaline bar is filled. When out of combat, the adrenaline bar slowly depletes, and once empty will kill the player. No time for sightseeing, and exploring secret areas can be a death sentence if an enemy is not waiting within. So while some of the game's locations might be interesting and filled with goodies to gather while exploring, there is always a timer on the player's activities that prevents them from sticking around for too long. I found some of these levels to contain a lot of interesting things to see, or hazards that I would have liked more time to be able to prepare for. The zoo has a lot of twisting paths and jumping across water that I would have liked more time to engage with. The fire in later levels deals a lot of damage and can kill the player quite quickly if they don't react in time. It also covers large parts of the path and is often a feature within most combat arenas. The bosses are poor and generally do not build on the rest of the combat system. Instead, there are awkward movement tests. The sewer snake, the snowman, and Jose Manuel are similarly not directly damaged by the player. The boss will use its attacks while the player dodges them to get to a location and activate some mechanism that damages the boss. The player knocks pillars onto the snake, blows up barrels that cause the building to collapse onto the snowman, and activates switches that extend spikes from the wall around Jose Manuel. Traversing the rooms with tank controls is by far the most challenging parts of these fights. Finally, Adam Crowley transforms into a demonic form of himself and battles the player as a normal enemy would. Crowley blocks almost all types of attack and cannot be damaged by the items. Instead, the player must use the same dashing attack to deal damage to him, which isn't quite the fantastic conclusion to the game I was hoping for, but it certainly is much better than the 3 other fights. The game's default difficulty is set to hard, but it can be changed to easy whenever the player chooses. On easy mode, the enemies deal less damage, but almost everything else is the same. In order for the player to heal and gain additional lives, they must find the items within levels. There are 2 types of healing items, as well as a few damage mitigation items, but there is only 1 item that rewards additional lives. Moreover, these items become rarer as the game goes on, and I was forced to play a lot of the game with a single life. Being returned to life by the item stands the player back up immediately where they had died, while a game over is punished by having to reload the entire level. Enemies can attack in ways that are a challenge to even determine what is hitting the player. The harpies and the gargoyles have a secondary hit that follows the first, but the animation for this hit is difficult to recognize. Taking hits late into the game is extremely punishing, as consistent healing resources and extra lives are very scarce. The buffer can also prevent the player's block from activating as they press it, which can also cause further frustration. The adrenaline mechanic I mentioned before is the most frightening part of this horror game by a wide margin. With the low draw distance and long corridors without enemies, the blue bar ticking down has inflicted more panic onto me than any of the trenchcoat zombies waiting in ambush could. It's fortunate that the player can block when not facing enemies too, because some attack so relentlessly that turning to face them would be almost impossible. But it isn't insurmountable. Finding an opening and relentlessly comboing an enemy to death is a very simple solution to these problems. It doesn't matter if the gargoyle's second hit is difficult to see if that gargoyle is stun-locked in an alleyway. For some games, their age adds to their legendary stature, and the awkwardness of early 3D is transcended by excessive high quality. For others, their age is an unscalable detractor, and an inexperienced player is most likely going to bounce off, never to return. For me, PN03 was a game far too bogged down in its unsuccessful design that I couldn't transcend the game's faults and enjoy it. Nightmare Creatures is a far higher quality experience than PN03, and is absolutely a game that I could recommend to play. In the context of it being a precursor to games like Dark Souls and Marlow Briggs, Nightmare Creatures is a fascinating game that is uncontested in its uniqueness on the platform. Without this context, I don't think any player will draw quite as valuable an experience. The controls are a challenge to get to grips with. The game is brutally punishing in places, and the narrative is barely present, so I can imagine this game won't attract many new fans. Overall, I think more positively of Nightmare Creatures than negatively. It is a quintessential example of early PlayStation and early 3D video games. It falls into many of the pitfalls from that era, but is filled with so much creativity and forward momentum that those faults are mostly blemishes. The setting is so unique that there were supposedly plans for a film adaptation alongside a pair of sequels, but the film and Game 3 never came to be. Additionally, Kalisto Entertainment folded in 2002 after the company had made it onto the French stock exchange and collapsed during the dot-com bubble. Perhaps the second game is just as good as the first. I'll have to check it out someday. Next time, I'll be looking at Cameroon's first internationally commercial video game. African PC gaming is finally here.